Could you comment on any perceived connection between, about a week and a half ago when Libya was blamed for the Pan Am bombing, all of a sudden, shortly thereafter, most of the Western hostages in Lebanon, who are supposedly held by Iranian and Syrian-controlled people, were mysteriously, coincidentally released. And that is very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it might mean something, it might not. I'd be cautious about drawing conclusions from that. I suspect that these arrangements to release the U.S. hostages precede the bombing of, the thing. I mean, look, these kind of, the sort of the Kuppermans and the Abe Rosenthal's and so on could be correct when they say that Iran and Syria are being let off the hook because they have some role to play in U.S. planning. Libya, remember, has been a punching bag for 10 years. It's easy. Every time there's a domestic problem, you go bomb Libya or you attack Libya or something like that. And that's easy. They're completely defenseless. Gaddafi nobody likes anyhow. Nobody's going to defend them. So you want to bomb them. That's kind of like automatic. Maybe Libya was involved. I mean, maybe not. Nobody still has any particular reason to believe that they were involved in the disco bombing in 1986. Maybe they were, but there was certainly no evidence around at the time that could convince a rational person. The German investigators didn't believe it. They thought it was complete fraud. This was all suppressed in the U.S. press, but it was published. Like I had an article about it right then, based on an interview with the head of what amounts to the German FBI, who was actually an interview carried out by a U.S. Stars and Stripes reporter, with the head of this thing saying there's not a particle of evidence that Libya had anything to do with this. This was a couple of weeks after the bombing. This is mostly propaganda, and notice that it's all, you shouldn't be deluded by it. I mean, if we were interested in terrorism, we could do simple things like going after, say, the people who were responsible for the worst air tragedy, the Air India flight, or who were responsible for the second worst one, namely the Iran airliner. We don't have to go very far to get those guys. We don't have to extradite anyone. All you have to do is walk over to the White House. And so if there was any concern with international terrorism, you'd know where to go. But whether this has anything to do with release of the hostages, we don't know. I mean, I don't know any more than you.
And the White House is going to have another war or some sort of conflict before the election, because he needs something to distract people.
If they aren't facing real domestic problems, and the meddling outsiders are beginning to make a fuss, and people really start paying attention, deciding, look, we've got to do something about this catastrophe around us, it'll be necessary to divert them, and there aren't many ways. One way is to set oppressed groups against one another. Actually, the Thomas hearings were a perfect example of that. You take the two most oppressed groups in the country and you set them at each other's throats. Perfect. The affirmative action thing is exactly the same. You don't have a meaningful unemployment program. A meaningful employment program, what you do is, if you're clever, what you do is target particular sectors so that other sectors equally deprived will hate those guys, instead of hating the guys who are picking up all the, that are making all the money and establishing the policy. So there's all these techniques which are standard and will continue, but the other major ones are the ones I mentioned. Foreign enemies who are going to overwhelm us, or at the magnificence of our leaders who rise up at the last minute in the nick of time to save us. That's standard, and they could resort to that. My guess is it would be Cuba, though.
Yeah, I guess some of us still need our fig leaves to keep hope. And in the Middle East, in the Madrid talks, the fact that the Palestinians went to that and agreed to it, some of us have been hoping that there would be a momentum that would build up so that there would be some conclusion which would be other than what you've described. What do you think of that?
I think that's possible only if there's enough internal pressure in the United States to compel the state to change its traditional policies. People who are going to have faith in George Bush and James Baker are simply contributing to oppression as well as contributing to the destruction of democracy here by fostering illusions. I mean, like you, I hope that something decent will happen there, but it's not going to happen unless there's enough domestic pressure. So, I mean, any ruling group has got to worry primarily about its domestic enemy The main enemy of any group that's in power anywhere is the domestic population. They got to be kept under control. If they become disruptive or do things, you got to react. Doesn't matter who you are, fascist state, a democratic society, anything. And if there's that kind of pressure, yeah, U.S. policy could shift. I mean, it's not a crucial interest of the United States that Palestinian rights be denied. It's a very marginal interest, kind of like Haitian democracy, very marginal interest. As a result, it could shift, but it'll require pressures here. Faith in, the goodwill of our leaders is just a way to make sure that things continue the way they are. Israeli Labor Party, there's no change. I mean, you take a look at the report. I mean, you take a look at the New York Times report and forget the headlines and read the words, and the Labor Party took its traditional position. Traditional Labor Party position has been complete rejectionism. I mean, I don't have time to run through it, but I was planning to. In fact, I have notes on it if you're interested. But and there's a lot of documentation on this in the Hebrew literature, a lot of interesting things to say. The Labor Party position has always been complete rejectionism and remains so. The Labor Party and Likud differ on the modalities. So the Labor Party has traditionally pursued what's been called the Alon plan. That's what's called territorial compromise here. Territorial compromise is a farce. Everybody in Israel knows that. Territorial compromise is the name for the plan which says Israel takes what it wants in the occupied territories, but takes no responsibility for the bulk of the population, who are administered by Jordan. Now that's minimally different from the Likud program, which says we extend sovereignty over the territories, but we grant the population autonomy, which means we don't take any responsibility for them. I mean, the differences between those proposals are minuscule. And in fact, many Israeli doves, authentic doves, not in the Labor Party, and Palestinian nationalists actually regard the Likud programs as more helpful to their interests. And yeah, but what does that mean? They tell you what that means? No, they didn't tell you what it means. Sure, they can say anything they like as long as they don't tell you what it means. And what it means is we'll take what we want in the territories. We will take the water. We will take the other resources. We'll take the nice suburbs around Jerusalem, which by now is a huge area extending well into the West Bank. And remember, and we'll take the Jordan Valley. In fact, we'll take everything that we want, but we won't take responsibility for the population because we don't want to pay for it. And we don't want to. And then comes what's called the demographic problem. It's another term of art, which means the problem of too many non-Jews in what is by law not the state of its citizens, but the state of the Jews. That's what it is. And the idea traditionally has been if the second-class citizens by law are sort of like 20% or less, you can kind of finesse it. And the New York Times will still talk about the symbol of human decency and all this kind of stuff. But if it gets to be 50%, starts to look like a Rhodesia or something, then it gets to be a problem. So you have this demographic problem, and you also have simply the problem of providing, extending the normal services that any state, whatever it is, provides to its own citizens. You got that problem, which is costly. And then there are two ideas on how not to do it. One is the Likud idea of autonomy, and the other is the labor idea of territorial compromise. They come out about the same way. They're not all that different. Incidentally, as far as extending Jerusalem and Israeli settlement in Jerusalem, including Russian Jews, is concerned, remember there are two issues there. One problem is to keep a Jewish majority, but another non-trivial problem is to keep a Zionist majority. Remember that a lot of the Jews in Jerusalem are non-Zionists or anti-Zionists, the whole religious group. And to go back to the Israeli literature, there's a phrase, they breed like rabbits, which is used for two groups, Palestinians and Orthodox Jews. They all breed like rabbits. The big problem is that and in fact a lot of these not all, but a lot of these Orthodox Jews are not only non-Zionists, a lot of them have called for Jordan to take control so they can have religious freedom again. So you have to keep expanding the population, the Zionist Jewish population, to overcome these two problems of those guys who breed like rabbits. So there's basically no disagreement on this. I mean, you look back at the settlement programs going way back to 1967. September 1967, the first Labor Party settlement program was internally announced by Shimon Peres, incidentally. internal. It's since been publicized. And it called for expansion around Jerusalem, settlement around Nablus, settlement in the Jordan Valley, settlement in the Golan Heights. In fact, pretty much what's happened.